Joining us now for updates on the legal fight that may be ahead is Harmeet Dhillon, the co-chair of the Republican National Lawyers Association and the CEO and founder of the Center for American Liberty. So Harmeet, I'm really glad to have you on the program tonight because we know that today there are some developments in favor of the Trump campaign coming in the state of Pennsylvania as well. But I want to get your input on the legal battle in general. Do you believe that there is a strong case so far?
Yes, there is a strong case, but a lot of people have kind of dumbed this down to just being fraud. And I don't think that that's a way to win this election, quite frankly. I think some of the big pieces are whether ballots were counted that shouldn't have been counted. And this may have happened in multiple states where the law says ballots have to be received by a certain day, or they have to have a date and a signature and an address on them, or they have to have a secrecy envelope. And some of those things are not there. Other instances that could make a difference in the outcome of the election is whether ballots have to be recounted where they weren't witnessed by Republican volunteers. And finally, you have Georgia where they're doing an automatic recount and audit, and it's by hand, using hand records, paper records. So these are the types of things that taken together could be enough to make a difference in the outcome. It is an uphill battle to change multiple states. So those are some of the challenges.
And in fact, we're hearing from Republican state senators in Michigan, too, that they're also looking for a recount in that state. But the development when it comes to Pennsylvania, I think you're right to say that it doesn't necessarily have to do with fraud, but it has to do with some of these ballots coming in after the allotted time period, the deadline that was created, and whether or not state executives have the power to make those kind of deadlines, because the Constitution is pretty clear that it's state legislatures that really have that power to do so. So when we look ahead to possible litigation brought forth by the Trump campaign, what do they have to prove? It's not, as you were saying, necessarily bringing in widespread voter fraud evidence, but more so looking at the law as it's written, correct?
That's right. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled on this issue of the elections and the Electors Clause of the United States Constitution, which in turn provides that only state legislatures make the time, place, and manner regulations in our voting. And earlier this year, our governor in California attempted to unilaterally impose a change in our voting laws, and we sued them. The Republican National Committee and Republican lawyers sued them. And the governor then went to the legislature to pass the same regulations that he wanted. And that's the correct way to do it, although I disagree with the regulations. But in Pennsylvania, where there is a Republican legislature and they refused to extend the deadline to receive the ballots to 3 days or more after the election, the Secretary of State, who dislikes the president, went ahead and did that on her own, and then she got that certified by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. That's the case before the United States Supreme Court. And today's ruling that you mentioned doesn't have to do with that issue, but it has to do with a separate issue that the Secretary of State imposed on the state, and that is that she attempted to extend the deadline by which first-time voters must provide the state with voter ID. That is by statute 6 days, which seems to be plenty of time, right? The voting is a precious right, and people should treat it seriously, to 9 days. And that's what the court today struck down and said she doesn't have the authority to do that.
And I believe that's referred to as curing the ballot, where they submitted the ballot and they do have a time period where they can go back and make the proper changes if need be. But as we were saying, it's not necessarily the job of an executive official in a state to unilaterally extend that time period. But I do want to touch on that first case as well, because Justice Samuel Alito, he did give the Trump campaign another victory in a sort earlier this week when he said that ballots that arrived after the deadlines, they can still be counted, but they have to be done so separately. And now, is the reason for that because this could end up before the Supreme Court, and in case there is any sort of remedy, they want to make sure that these ballots aren't tainted in the sense that they're all put together, and you can't necessarily differentiate between the two types?
That is the issue. Now, the problem is that the Supreme Court already ordered that before the election. And yet, a few days later, when these parties went back to court, the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania and the Trump side were unable to tell the court that indeed that segregation had occurred, because the counties in the state said they were unable to give that assurance. So that's very troubling. So in fact, there may not have been a segregation occurring before that second order by Justice Alito. So what does that mean? Well, in addition to the fact that there are 600,000 ballots that apparently were not witnessed at all in Pennsylvania, that could suggest a need for a recount. Under Pennsylvania law, the state is supposed to keep the envelopes and supposed to have a date stamp on each ballot or envelope what day they received it. So even though they didn't segregate them, those paper records are supposed to be there. Are they? We shall see.
And I think that is actually a very important maybe because, for example, I'm trying to think this out logically, and if these ballots were counted in their totality, for example, and the Supreme Court eventually does take up a case and say, you know what, anything that did arrive after this deadline should not be counted because that's against the law as it's written. We know that there are now conservative textualists on the Supreme Court as well. So say, for example, that the state of Pennsylvania did combine these ballots and they counted them all, but now the Supreme Court rules, for example, and says, you know what, anything that arrives after the deadline can't be counted, but we don't really necessarily have a way to differentiate between those. What then happens? Would it be an ask for a totally new election? Would it be asking for certain votes to be counted in a different way? Then what happens?
Well, it's very interesting. It's somewhat unprecedented, but you may recall that there was a ballot harvesting scandal in the 2018 election in a nearby state of North Carolina, where I grew up, and there was where it's illegal. And indeed, the Republican candidate staffer was accused of doing that, and ultimately a new election was called as a remedy. And so. Obviously, we don't want that, and I don't want to assume that the records aren't there necessarily, okay? But if the records are there, we ought to be able to unscramble that egg, as it were, and there should be a recount anyway, based on the fact that Republicans weren't allowed to observe that. But, bottom line, elections are about numbers, right? So right now, there's a 50,000 vote spread putatively between the two sides in Pennsylvania. The Secretary of State of Pennsylvania has come out and said it's about 10,000 or so ballots that were received after the date, although I don't know how she can say that when she told the Supreme Court she's not sure how, whether those ballots were being segregated or not. But if it is 10,000, that's out of 40,000. So you have to find another way to close that gap. And there are places to do that. The places to do that include Philadelphia counting a number of ballots that, according to state law, are incomplete. They don't have the date. They don't have the address. They don't have the signature necessarily, and they don't have that secrecy envelope. One of those problems, those should not have been counted, okay? And then there's other counties that have just simply voted in their local election boards to ignore state law that requires ballots to be dated. And those are important laws, and they are there for a reason. And so if you add up all of these irregularities and you do a recount, it is possible to make up that vote difference, but there are a lot of ifs there.
Yeah, and I've heard some people say this too. The media may have the first word when it comes to calling this election, but it seems that there's no doubt that the federal courts will have the last. It seems like this is going to the courts. It's just a matter of how they end up deciding on this. So I advise everybody to just stay calm, wait for these results to play out, because at this point it is too close to call, as you were saying. But Harmeet Dhillon, I really appreciate you coming on the program tonight, breaking down the complexities of this situation. Thank you.